Energy is the single most vital ingredient after human capital to sustaining an advanced industrialized economy. By 2035, the International Energy Agency estimates the world must invest $48 trillion to meet the projected energy demands. Oil and gas have historically been the largest share of global energy spending, but for the first time in 2016, electricity entered the top spot. Oil still remains the most essential component to the omnipresent transportation sector of the economy, but because of the steadily decreasing new discoveries and increased depletion of reserves from growing demand in emerging economies, many energy analysts describe this turning point as peak oil. When the oil runs dry, prices skyrocket, and as we've seen in the 1970s and 2000s, industrialized economies struggle. Despite the volatility inherent to the oil market, the trend over the past 20 years has been a consistent rise in prices and ever more strain placed on the ecological balance of the earth as growing populations consume more land and resources. As in all ecosystems, however, the carrying capacity will assert itself one way or another, and despite technology's ability to extend the life of an industrialized society, the physical limits of growth will inevitably constrain the size and scope of unabated consumerism. Despite the interests of big business, this downshifting may actually represent an opportunity for an increase in the quality of life for the rest of us.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time, steadily.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we're going to be talking about energy. But before we do that, let me introduce my co-hosts. So Nick.
Woo!
Hans.
Hello.
Alex.
Hi, guys.
And Hank.
Hey, everyone.
So why is this important? Well, basically everything that you use today in this sort of industrial, post-industrial economy, whether it's your iPhone, the electricity that runs on the iPhone, the people who sat in an office in some globalist bug city to make that app, all use energy. And all the food that you have is sort of grown in a very industrialized way, a lot of machinery, a lot of petrochemicals going to the fertilizer, nitrogen being the main one. And then the transportation after that is actually the second most intensive use of the energy to bring all of that food to you. And not only that, obviously all the manufactured goods are not even made locally anymore where they used to be. You don't have local blacksmiths or shoesmiths or anything like that. You basically have a globalized trading system where giant shipping containers go on giant shipping container ships that go to these massive ports like the Port of Los Angeles or Long Beach, and they go through places like Panama Canal, traveling thousands of miles over the ocean, running on bunker fuel, and all that stuff is derived from oil. So oil is probably the single most critical aspect of our energy strategy as humans right now, because it is incredibly potent in terms of the energy stored per gallon. Whatever measure you use, it's just way up there. And I can give you a simple metric to prove that. So the car batteries in everybody's car have at least 40 times lower energy density than the chemical energy stored in gasoline. Now, if you're talking about diesel, it's even worse. And so diesel is actually more, there's more BTUs per gallon of diesel than gasoline. But you can't necessarily run everything on diesel for various technical reasons. It's mainly used in trucks, but the engines that you have to make for them are much more expensive, and they don't work as well in cold weather conditions. The starting is more difficult because they don't use spark plugs. They actually just run on compression. And so that is sort of the long and short of why energy is sort of incredibly important, and also why oil in particular is important. So where does oil come from? Oil is, if you don't believe the conspiracists or it's not a conspiracy, but it's basically people who will argue that oil is actually naturally grown in the in the earth, which I think is ridiculous.
Comes out of the ground, man.
Yeah, I forget what it's called. It's some theory about like the homeo whatever, something like that of oil.
This is the Soviet theory that's discredited now, I think.
Okay, but as far as I know, it's basically decayed plant and animal matter it looks like essentially what you'd expect if a bunch of you took a bunch of livestock and you threw them in a pit and you just left them for 100 years. It just basically it's just compressed solar energy, and the reason it's so potent is because you can just burn it, and it after you've refined it, of course, it just has these chemical properties and these chains of molecules that burn really well. But even then, you only get 30% of the energy out of the gasoline that you burn in your engine. So there's issues with it in terms of that. But the main issue, this is really why it's sort of why we're talking about this, is because it's a finite resource. So we're essentially burning in the past 200 years of the Industrial Revolution since then, what took millions of years to accumulate over time. And that basically took a lot of geological pressure. It took a lot of things to die. And a lot of the reason, we get a lot of oil from places like Saudi Arabia is because that used to be underwater. And so all of that decaying animal matter in the ocean had to fall down onto the ocean floor. And then it took probably a billion years, who knows how long it took actually, but at least we're talking millions of years to create that. And we're basically using that up in a course of 200 years. And the reason why the sort of people say that, and this is called peak oil, the reason why they say this is running out is because it's just you can look at the number of discoveries per year. Last year was actually the record lowest number of amount of oil discovered in the past in history, and the past 3 years have actually had a declining amount of oil newly discovered each year. So once you pull it out of the ground, you burn it, and then you have to find more oil. So these oil majors, they're called. So you've got your Exxons, your Royal Dutch Shells, your BPs, et cetera. And then, of course, you have the nationals who are in Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, naming the big ones off the top of my head. They all have to explore. They're basically integrated companies that go out. They search for oil, so they're called exploration companies. In addition to what they do then is refining, and then in addition to what they do then finally is distribution. And so there's companies that specialize in each of those pieces, but the majors are usually the ones that are watched because they have the most sophisticated technical ability in terms of their ability to find things and to come up with alternatives. For example, Shell and BP have dumped billions of dollars into alternative energy because they believe that eventually they're not going to have oil at some point, so they had to be able to transition. And so they are typically watched by Wall Street and financial economists and investors and people like that. And Shell got in trouble, for example, a few years ago for actually over-reporting the amount of reserves they had on hand. And so they're under a lot of pressure to actually have oil, and they're still having trouble coming up with it. And so the extents to which the oil industry will go to find this stuff is getting more and more extreme. And so you have them operating in places like Africa now, Nigeria, maybe Ghana, I can't remember exactly, but Western Africa has the most oil. If you're excluding Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, that's where most of it is. It's sort of around that Nigeria region. And they're having to make these strange deals, and they have to go to all corners of the earth to find it. And I can go into this later, but what I wanted to do was just explain why this is important. And so then I'd like to shift at the moment to some of the history as to how we got to this. Before I do that, do you guys have any quick comments or thoughts?
I would. So there's a lot of kind of caveats around this whole thing. Like there's this idea of a lot of the exploration and well development activity is itself driven by the price of oil. So you see this kind of a tempered lagging effect where if you have oil really cheap for a long time, eventually investment in new sourcing dries up. And it's not like a moment-to-moment thing. Like these guys know that this can be a fickle industry, so you need to make long-term capital-intensive investments. But that's kind of a conflating factor when we talk about how few discoveries there have been, because it's not like the rate of exploration is constant either.
That's a good point, Hank. It's a dynamic equilibrium. So that may have something to do with why discoveries have been a bit lower in the last few years, because in 2014 oil prices collapsed. We had oil around $45, $50 a barrel for a few years. Now it's back up to about $75 a barrel. But I'd throw these numbers out to put things into context. So these are nice round numbers. The entire world uses about 100 million barrels a day of sort of normalized oil, normalized into Brent or WTI, West Texas Intermediate. These are just benchmark, high-quality crude oils. So 100 million total consumption. The USA, Russia, and Saudi Arabia each make about 10 million, or pump about 10 million barrels a day. KSA is a little bit lower now, 9 million barrels. So that's about
Well, I heard that the United States is actually doing about 10, and so that's fascinating that they're producing less than the United States, and Russia is 11, I believe.
It's going to depend where you get your numbers from, but yeah, it's something like 11 or 10 or 9 for these three big oil powers. They're the big players, and then you have smaller outfits, Mexico and smaller players. But these three are really the dominant players in the oil markets.
Yeah, and also I want to throw some numbers about the consumption side. So that's the production side Alex just mentioned. What the United States consumes every day is about 15 million barrels, and so we make about 10 million, or in terms of like we don't make it, we pull it out of the ground, we get it ready for market. And then some of that actually is exported, and the reason it's exported is because we can't use it. It's too light. And so what that means is when you put it in a refinery, you're not going to get all the sort of types of fuel that you would need to use for the various aspects of what oil is actually turned into. And so you've got your jet fuel, you got your diesel, you got naphtha, which is basically gasoline, and then all the bunker fuels and things like that. But the light stuff, here's another thing that I should mention as to why it's sort of the money is sort of telling us that there may not be a lot of oil left around. The reason I say that is because we could take this oil and refine it, but we don't because nobody wants to build the refineries in the United States. So what ends up happening is it's exported. And when you hear these numbers about record exports in the United States, we're now a huge energy superpower. It's sort of I think a chimera. I mean, people are not really understanding what's going on. A lot of that shale oil that's getting pulled out now with the new fracking technologies is just it's too light to work in the refineries that are existing in the United States. And if they wanted to make the refineries, they could, but the fact that they're not is very telling, and it sort of tells me that the shale thing is not going to last. That's one of the things that I've heard. I've heard other people get into that, but we can debate shale later. But I just wanted to talk about the consumption. And so, if we make
there are regulatory burden barriers to building new refineries as well.
Yeah. Okay. At the same time, though, it's such a huge moneymaker. I'd be surprised if Texas, for example, couldn't build some refineries in Houston. Houston is truly Blade Runner. If you go down there and you see how many giant pieces of infrastructure exist in terms of what it does for the oil complex. It's like all refineries on the water.
And when you talk about building a refinery, you're not just talking about, okay, well, I built this basically factory and it's got a pipe going in and a pipe going out. You're also talking about how much human capital is there in this area? Like, can I actually get petroleum engineers to work here? If it's some place where I'm kind of trying to do this from scratch, like it might actually be difficult to get people to move out of there as opposed to staying where it's kind of more concentrated. You also need like a distribution network. So you need good roads that go wherever you plan on shipping this stuff. And you need kind of prospective customers in that area.
Well, a lot of the U.S. story is natural gas too. So people are saying the United States is energy self-sufficient, which is, I believe, that's true in terms of BTUs. But most of that is natural gas.
Correct. Natural gas is a much brighter story than oil in the United States. The shale oil stuff is you got about on the high end, and Alex would attest to this number, about 30 years. On the low end, and I would attest to this number, about 10 years in terms of adding to the energy mix.
The big shale oil play in the United States is worth about 200 days of global consumption, to put it into, at the current estimates of its size. It may be much bigger, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and also you can go to the EIA, which is the Energy Information Administration, run by the U.S. government. Believe it or not, I don't know, but it's supposed to be nonpartisan and
It's great.
Corporate. It's a great
resource.
It's a great organization of numbers. So the EIA has these numbers for the United States. Currently, we have about 35 billion barrels of oil in reserves. And to put that in context, we use about 7 billion a year. So effectively, we've got less than 6 years if we completely shut off all imports and we used all of our oil. And that is, to me, the most striking number about this whole thing, is that if we got into a war, or if we got into a situation where we just weren't trading with other countries, we would have to ration. No question about it. There would be huge rationing and shortages and things like we saw in the 70s. No doubt in my mind. So the reserves are a very critical number people need to pay attention to, because when they talk about production, that's very price driven, as my co-hosts have been mentioning, and it's also just driven by you've got these drills already there, these wells drilled, and so you've got to run them. It's partly economic, basically, and so I think that's a very telling number. So do we want to get into more details on this, or are we ready to go back to the history of why oil is used in the first place, where it comes from, and all that?
Just as a kind of a side note, there's a big difference between sort of reserves, full stop, proved reserves, and exploitable reserves. So you can kind of have a best guess that there's a certain amount of oil that's actually in the ground. That's your sort of reserves, full stop, your estimated reserves. But you don't really know that for certain until you start actually drilling a bunch of test holes to kind of prove the extent of this thing. Like, I don't know, maybe there's a giant hole in the middle, or whatever. So you can have significantly fewer proved reserves than you think are actually indicated by the data. But that oil might be incredibly expensive to actually get out of the ground. Like, one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia was such a huge oil producer, especially kind of in the earlier part of the 20th century, was not necessarily because of the size of their reserves. It's because their production costs were basically nothing.
Yeah, they call those lifting costs. I mean, basically, you're drilling a well down. How much does it cost to lift it out? And I heard a number that was like $5 a barrel. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah. And compared to the United States, the shale industry needs like what, 50 to 60. It's much more expensive here.
And when we get into maybe a little bit later, but there's kind of more exotic production technologies that have much higher would have higher effective output, things that rely on actual kind of chemistry operating on random biomass that have production costs that are like well above, into the $100 or more per barrel, but have theoretically a lot more headroom in terms of the supply that they can generate, which doesn't do you a lot of good if you're in some industry that needs cheap energy in order to function, but still manages to at least kind of put an effective cap on the price that oil can rise to.
Right. The supply curve is upward sloping. So, at $200 a barrel hypothetical oil, then you can start doing coal gasification and things like that.
Yeah, the Fischer-Topska, whatever it's called, technology that was made in Germany during World War One. But yeah, it's very expensive. You can do it though, and I don't think the oil infrastructure, just to throw this out there quickly, I don't think the usage of petroleum is going to go away. I just think the price is going to go up a lot, and I think the prioritization of how it's used is going to change a lot, because I think the need for it is higher in certain places than other places, and I think the way we operate our society is going to change because of that. But I think we can talk about that in the latter half. So do you guys want to get into a little bit of the history? I just think it's critical that we cover it at least a little bit because yeah. So oil has been known, for thousands of years. It used to just like trickle up out of the ground because nobody was really using it. Coal was actually more important during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to power steam engines. But the transportation industry is really the reason why the oil complex, if we want to call it that, has taken off. It's because of that energy density of that liquid is why it's stored in vehicles that need to go somewhere. That's the reason it's used so much. And so historically, oil was just kind of useless to most people. It was sort of a pest because they were trying to farm the land and they couldn't because it was contaminating the water and whatnot. And so it was known, for a long time. I mean, it used to probably be used for things like sealing, using it as tar or whatnot. And I think this is documented, going back to like Egypt and things like that. But people didn't know that they could really make much use of it in terms of transportation, and so for thousands of years, if only hundreds, the sort of technology just wasn't there to make use of it. What changed though was in Germany when I believe it was Otto Benz who basically kind of came up with the automobile and the sort of engines that were running on internal combustion that really made this industry boom. And that was in the late 1800s. And at the time, I think Rockefeller lived if not to 100, pretty close to it. I can't remember exactly. But he was involved in Standard Oil, which was centered around Cleveland, Ohio. And what they did basically was just provide, I believe it was kerosene, but it was basically just a derivative of oil for lighting. It was just basically lamp oil. That was the primary usage of their product, and they were very good at it. They had distribution all over the world, and they were competing with Royal Dutch Shell out in Indonesia, where actually the Dutch had most of their oil coming from at the time. And so it really took the Model T, though, to explode the automobile industry to then make Rockefeller into a billionaire.
If you look at a chart from the EIA on energy usage in the United States from the beginning of the revolution until 2012, you can see coal get toppled in terms of its total energy usage in the mid-1920s because of the rise in oil usage. And that's mostly because Henry Ford.
All right, so when Rockefeller is making his money in Standard Oil, actually I should point out that the Standard Oil Company was broken up by the sort of trust-busting agencies of the United States founded by Teddy Roosevelt. And this actually ironically made him even wealthier because the price of the components of Standard Oil tripled roughly. And the business, though, again, is founded on this sort of non-renewable energy, and so you have to, or resource, and so you have to continuously look for the oil and drill for it. And so what the original source of oil in the United States primarily was coming from was Titusville, Pennsylvania. That was the original source of the big discovery there. After that, New York to varying degrees, and then really the big one was Texas. I think it was Spindletop. There may have been Oklahoma, but basically that region is a huge oil producer for the United States. Obviously, everybody knows that, and the Gulf region and where Mexico gets its oil is all basically part of that. And I would sort of say, without sort of knowing too much about the geology, I would say that's probably due to the fact that there's a lot of similarity to the sort of shallow sea to what Saudi Arabia used to have with the ocean covering that. And so a lot of that sort of sea life that sort of fell into the ocean floor basically got deposited there.
So about 300 to 250 million years ago in the Permian age, Texas was not only at the equator, but much of it was underwater, especially the Permian Basin, which we can talk about later, was underwater. So you're getting maximum solar output for 100 million years or more in this region, while you also have that effect of the ocean producing the whatever biological processes and geological processes result in oil rather than coal.
I should add, with respect to the trust busting thing, I wouldn't describe that as an irony. That was Roosevelt was a Morgan man, and Morgan was, of course, seventh cousin to Rockefeller. The so-called trust busting is a myth of the progressive era.
Well, I'm glad you point that out because, and J.P. Morgan, which became J.P. Morgan Chase, and Chase Bank was basically the Rockefeller Bank. So you can see the connections. That's interesting.
And
Always
was a
look
tool
at
of the Morgan.
look at what happens, not what the rhetoric is, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Watch people's actions rather than what they say. So basically, oil is sort of this finite resource. Where are you going to get it? You have to continuously look for it. And Texas was big, but at the time of, I think, the beginning of the Second World War, the United States still was the largest producer. But they were starting to realize that this was actually sort of going to not continue. And I should point out also that as sort of proof of the importance of the United States at that time, the Japanese were embargoed from getting U.S. oil after they began their campaign of conquest in East Asia. And that was what they argued for as the main reason why they attacked Pearl Harbor, because they had to sort of get out from under the Yankee control of that region so they could basically pursue more imperialism in the Dutch East Indies so they could grab the oil down there around Borneo and such. So that sort of demonstrates the sort of global nature of the oil market and where you're going to get it. And the next big find, and I should mention briefly, California had some oil, but that's pretty much spent at this point. The next place that really became important, and I should also mention, going back a little bit, that the British Navy was pretty instrumental in making oil sort of a critical factor on the geopolitical stage, because they switched from coal to oil around World War I, and that made sort of the resources in the Middle East that they had sort of some influence over very important for them. And they,
go ahead.
Was
that for in terms of safety? Like, I imagine coal dust is much more likely to explode if you get hit with a shell than maybe an oil tank.
I've never looked into the actual mechanics of it. I would assume, though, that the efficiency of oil-based engines is probably higher than coal.
It is a power density thing. So there's a nice part in the David Daniel Jurgen book, the prize, where they talk about the rationale that the British had for switching from coal, which they have in effectively infinite amounts in the UK, to oil for their ships. And my understanding is, with the oil, you can actually run full-on turbines, and you can run them quite faster. So your ships will be faster. They'll be able to get from port to port faster, which gives you significant strategic advantages, even if you account for the fact that now you've got to ship the stuff from the Dutch East Indies or whatever all over the world.
Yeah, the way internal combustion engines work is pretty marvelous, and I just think in terms of just the raw torque you're going to get out of basically the flame front that's created in the combustion chamber, which is sort of a misnomer. It doesn't actually explode or anything, but it's actually not a misnomer. It burns, but it doesn't explode. That's the common mistake. But as opposed to coal, which is basically like this steam system, and so you have to heat up water in these big boilers, and the steam is what pushes the pistons. What's actually happening in the combustion engine is that the air and fuel is ignited, and so you have this giant ball of fire that's actually pushing the piston down, which seems to be a more direct transfer of energy in terms of kinetic energy versus chemical energy than putting it through a water-based system where there's going to be heat loss, energy loss, and then it has to be moved into steam, and then steam is expanding, pushing the piston, and then that steam has to be cooled, or you have to have a continuous resupply of water. I don't know if it has to be fresh water for steam engines, but probably can't use salt water too much for corrosion reasons and perhaps other reasons as well. And so just the steam engine is just much bulkier. It's much more indirect.
More
and
crew
also,
members. You need to have guys to shovel it. Like
yeah,
the
probably.
Titanic.
I don't know how manual that stuff is, or if it's just
Well,
kind of
they
a
were shoveling
picture of-
coal on the Titanic in 1912, so
Okay.
that's basically state of the art.
Seems like you could have manual conveyor systems. I'm surprised they didn't have those, but yeah, I don't just doubt you. I just I've always wondered about actually why they didn't have more automated systems. But be that as it may, I also think, as Hank mentioned, there is a lot of coal in Britain, but by the time Thatcher got into government, they were basically shutting them down because it was just so fucking expensive. And so I think it perhaps was a cost thing as well. Oil was probably at that time a bit cheaper, and it also wouldn't necessarily exhaust the coal in the UK, which they could use for other uses, such as domestic electricity production. And so if I were a strategic planner in the British government, I would say, well, let's keep some of this stuff for our other critical industries, and then if we can source the transportation fuel that we need for our ships elsewhere without depleting our reserves of this other critical element, let's do that. So I would say that's it's a diversification thing, it's an efficiency thing, power thing, and it's partly I think a cost thing as well, because by the time, as I said, Thatcher got into government, pulling that coal out was just they were losing money. It was basically just a jobs bank, which has some merit, but be that as it may, if you're trying to run a big military, you can't waste all your resources on certain things. So they had some influence in the Middle East, and this became really, really important after the end of the First World War with Sykes-Picot and all the sort of treaties that were signing about dividing up the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire occupied basically all of the oil, with the exclusion of perhaps Iran, all of the oil in the Middle East. And so when that got carved up, the British sort of had for a brief period, a lot of energy in that region until the Arab nationalism became more of an issue, and then this is partly why to this day the sort of Western powers are trying to maneuver in that region and destabilize it, because the Arab nationalists are effectively going to boot out any foreigners and gain control of the resources. And Israel is actually a big part of that, because all the Jews in England who were getting concessions from the British government for Palestine were thought to be sort of a bulwark against Arab nationalism, because Israel doesn't have any oil, but if you have this sort of ally in that region who can sort of diminish the power of these Arab nationalists, then you've got something, because then if they're weaker, then you can get what you need out of them a little bit more easy. And so I think that explains some of the sort of petrodollar economics, geopolitics we have today, with the role of Israel destabilizing the entire region.
Tellingly, the only Arab nationalist regime that had a lot of oil was Iraq. I mean, Saudi Arabia and the other smaller countries on the Arabian Peninsula, where the really big reserves are. They're whatever you want to call them, puppet monarchs or vassal monarchs, or maybe they're the masters themselves. But they're certainly on the Anglo-Israeli team.
Oh, big time. Yeah, and the whole, we'll just go into this briefly, but the whole toppling of Mossadegh in Iran that was set up by basically the British and CIA was sort of in response to what the British and Americans were doing after the Second World War in that region, because they were basically trying to control a very weak Shah to give them access to oil. I believe it was one of the origins of British petroleum. It was I forget the name of it, but I think it had like Persia in it, and so the role of Iran was critical back then as well. So where are we? I mean, I guess we can sort of get into maybe the 70s, where the oil crisis happened, and the Yom Kippur War in, I believe it was 73, kicked off this big embargo. I was listening to this.
We will do a full show on at some point.
Yeah, it's such a critical period, because it just, again, you rip oil out of the equation, and then the entire economy and way of life changes for the industrialized economies. Not only that, I mean, obviously the politics are involved in that because of that. And so you're talking about huge wars potentially. You're talking about huge treaties and treaties being broken by a lot of these nation states and empires. But real quick, I was listening to a very good report, I'll link to it, by Corbett, who's Canadian, but he's living in Japan for 10-something years now. And so he produces these Corbett reports, which are very good. I would say pretty similar to what we do. He just kind of does it himself. But very high-quality reports on hidden history, trying to understand sort of conspiracies or things they don't tell you about. And he did an excellent presentation on oil and sort of the history behind it and why to this day it's still very influential on our society and political machinery. And he was saying about the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo was that it's actually something that Kissinger was maybe not starting, but he was actually involved with that sort of period very heavily on a back channel level with the higher levels of government in Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are ostensibly rivals. But it's sort of telling when somebody asked the Shah of Iran, why are you raising prices by 4 times after the Yom Kippur War? And he said, well, ask Henry Kissinger. So apparently that was something that Kissinger was involved in. And the reason he was doing that, okay, obviously he's Jewish and he's sort of trying to gain sort of a position for Israel that doesn't equal incineration after the Arab countries are potentially going to attack it. He was basically trying to get the Arab nations to stand down using the U.S. military, bring us, I think, to DEFCON 2. I can't remember what level we got to. I think DEFCON 1 is war. But we were floating B-52 bombers over the region after that. And he was doing the military strategy, and also he got the economic strategy in place. What was also going on at the time, this is very complicated stuff, but Corbett lays it out pretty well. But basically what was going on at the time was Nixon was still trying to basically wind down the Vietnam situation, or at the time, actually, I think it was over, but the financial state of the United States was really poor because of the Vietnam War, which had been going on for roughly 10 years at that time. And so what happened was the gold window was closed by Nixon because there was a run on the gold reserves of the United States led by the French and the Germans, I think, following, because the balance of payments in the United States was negative at that time. We think we'd gone into that in the 60s, and I blame primarily the Vietnam War, but also just our sort of lackluster national industrial policy. But also it was sort of this gold window thing that basically knocked off the status of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. And so in order to sort of sustain that status, the petrodollar was sort of dreamed up by various people in Washington and New York. And the way it worked was essentially, if you're going to be buying oil, you have to pay for it in dollars. And Alex, you can sort of jump in if you want to sort of critique it. We did a whole show.
We don't need to relitigate that.
Yeah.
If people want to hear my objections to that, they can check out our episode on the petrodollar that we did a couple of years ago.
Right. And I think that was a good show. So definitely check that out. I'll link to it. And Alex is, as he said, he came up with some good sort of arbitrage explanations, basically, from what I remember. But the sort of idea, at least, was that the Saudis, especially, were going to be only selling, because they were sort of the biggest producers at the time. They're going to only be selling their oil in dollars, and so instead of having gold as sort of the backing behind the dollar, it's now oil. What Corbett contributes to sort of this analysis, though, is that the oil industry loved this, obviously, because the prices are going to go up. And at the Bilderberg meeting, as much as you may dismiss that as conspiracy nonsense, apparently there was a meeting where I think the members of OPEC were attending right before this all happened. And in conjunction with that, there were a lot of bankers there, American bankers, and a lot of oil people there. And so the bankers made off on this because they were getting, and they call them petrodollars, all these dollars that the Saudis were accumulating by selling their oil and this is the second part of the agreement, had to be placed in New York banks. And so if you're a banker, you're going to get all this sort of deposits that you can then lend out, in which they subsequently lent to South America and then lost a lot of money on. But nonetheless, when you got a government like the United States who's going to bail you out, who cares, right? So they were involved. So the bankers, the oil companies, and the Arab nations were involved as well. And who's getting the short end of the stick? It's basically the people who are paying at the pump. If you still believe that the democracies of the world are there to sort of serve the people, I think this is yet another example where it just doesn't happen. It's the people who have the money who are making the decisions, so that was a big event in the sort of oil industry when the prices went up by 4 times.
What I would want to highlight in the prices going up, the key factor here is the supply of oil dropping. So there's an embargo, there's an Arab embargo. They basically just stopped pumping oil, and that's what's driving the price up in real terms. So they're cutting back oil production, or they stop outright. I can't remember the details exactly, but that's what's allowing the price to go up. And then, of course, this is the 1970s. U.S. oil production peaked roughly 1970, 1971, and then it sort of flatlines and then drops in the through the 90s. But that would have been bad enough. But what Nixon did was he put in price controls. And so that's what causes the lines that people's parents,
right,
people born in the 50s and 60s might remember waiting in line to get gas. You would have been able to buy all the gas that you wanted. We had a similar run-up in oil prices in the sort of 2005 to 2008 era, but you could get gas at that time. It wasn't too hard to get gas, and that's because they let prices. They didn't try to control prices, so there was no shortage. If you've ever taken an economics course, you will know that one of the basic results is when you don't allow prices you don't use markets to find prices, you get a shortage.
And Nixon was a very bright man. I mean, I think, Alex, you've mentioned before that, was it Friedman that said that
yes,
of all the presidents he's met, Nixon was the smartest?
Yes, and he met them all. He met all the presidents through George W. Bush.
He mentioned Clinton. Clinton also was very bright, but go ahead. Yeah.
This is what ruined Friedman's relationship with Nixon was, because Friedman was a real free market guy, was Friedman basically, Nixon ignoring Friedman's warnings
Friedman was
about
a
wages.
Free market guy,
Yeah, sorry. So that ruined their relationship, and Friedman had, I think no contact with Nixon after the wage and price controls.
Well, Friedman was right. I mean, the reason Nixon did that was political, because the American public doesn't understand the basic supply and demand concept very well, unfortunately. And I think the reason, Nixon correctly, identified that, or did what he did, was he identified that this fact of the public would not understand that and would appreciate the president trying to step in, effectively militarily to try to control the crisis. He was an astute politician, and so I think that got the best of him. And I think I've heard economists basically say that about why he did that as well. It's basically like he basically put politics before the economics. So it was a selfish thing on his part, actually, but he wanted to, stay in office, I guess, for as long as he could, which didn't work out for him. But one other thing, it wasn't just the sort of consumer level stuff that actually hurt. It was actually not just that. It was the American economy, and also most of the sort of quote unquote first world was still running on a very industrial level. This is pre-China taking over the factory system of the planet, but places like Japan and Germany were experiencing big economic problems because of the lack of energy. If you want to run a factory, you're basically running massive amounts of electricity to keep those machines running, and the way you produce electricity is through coal and through other means, but they're very correlated because there's substitution effects that happen when there's a literal shortage of something. So things start getting transferred over for production of things, even if the prices go up. And so you're going to have a broadly rising price of energy. And so Japan in particular got hit pretty hard because they're reliant on imports of oil. And they were a very heavily manufacturing-oriented economy that was growing tremendously. after the Second World War, I might add, as was Germany. But I think in particular Japan is an interesting case because of their island status, where they have to basically bring in most of their energy. And this is the reason they got into nuclear in the first place, because they didn't want to rely on this stuff as much. And so perhaps the reason why we had a Fukushima is partly related to the fact that the oil crisis happened. So I think we should get into that later about alternatives to oil. But this is a very good case study of what happens when you have a supply shock, when you have shortages and things like this. People start scrambling, and it really throws a wrench into the machinery of the economy. Not just at the consumer driving level. Yeah.
This fourfold increase in oil you're talking about for a few years, that also, that papered over a lot of the problems in the Soviet Union, at least for a good half decade or more.
Oh, big time. Big time. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the reason the Soviet Union could pay for that Afghanistan war until it couldn't was because of oil. And it was... I've mentioned this before. I'm not like this is original research on my part, but I agree with this thesis that James Baker going over to Saudi Arabia to get the Saudis to basically increase their oil production to lower oil prices to basically put the Soviets out of commission was a key part in the United States winning the Cold War. Very surprisingly not known, but that was huge. It wasn't just the military buildup, which did contribute a lot. It was Afghanistan bankrupting the Soviets. It was the fact that they were putting in half or more of their entire economy into making military weapons and gear. It was being propped up by their primary export, which was oil. That was their cash crop, effectively.
They were importing wheat. I mean, think about that. Like
Yeah.
Russia and Ukraine, they're importing wheat.
Yeah, and the food aspect, I mean, this is sort of a sidebar, obviously, but the food aspect of the Soviet Union was a big element of why they collapsed, because they couldn't even feed their people. They were really running a militarized economy. It was still the Second World War or something, and they just had nothing else, effectively. So, but oil was a big part of that, and it still is today. I mean, Russia basically exports AK-47s, a lot of zinc, some steel. It's not that much because it's not as high quality, and oil. And so that's what they need.
They have a well-developed agricultural industry. I mean, they have the sanctions on now.
They're self-sufficient, which I admire, but it's not an export leader for them.
I'm not sure about that, but they have the sanctions in place now. But they make, Russia makes all sorts of things these days. It's not like the old Soviet Union where they don't make anything. But it's a fair enough point. They do have some specialties in,
Well, Putin admits this. You could find video clips of him basically talking about the lack of diversification in the Russian economy is a problem, and he says this is a known problem. We've known about this.
Yeah.
And so, I think that, we're not really disagreeing here. It's just. It is what it is, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. It's just how it is. So, let's sort of let's go through the 80s real quick. Basically, what happened was with the high prices, sort of Texas had this huge boom, and if you ever watch the show Dallas, it's a great show. I'd recommend it. You sort of see why that region got as gaudy and gaudy as it got. It was basically all this money was flooding in because of those high prices, and then that fell apart. Actually, in the 90s, I think oil got down to something ridiculous, $8 a barrel.
There's a bear market in oil, really, from the mid 1980s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think part of the reason the savings and loan crisis happened was related to some of the lending that was going on in Texas. That sort of the bottom dropped out when the oil price fell. But I don't quote me on that. I vaguely remember something like that in the late 80s and mid 80s and stuff like that. But basically look at the price of oil and sort of connect the dots to regions that depend on oil, and you can start to see when prices are high, things are going pretty well, and then when prices are low, then you've got issues. So, where does that bring us? I think when oil became sort of interesting in recent times was sort of around 2000 and on, when prices of oil were spiking again. And it really got bad after Iraq. And we can sort of speculate as to why Iraq happened. I'm not of the camp that it was to grab the oil, which did not happen, first of all, but second of all...
yeah, that didn't work out too well.
I think the Chinese got more oil than we did. I
Oh,
remember saying
definitely.
that several Chinese companies actually had contracts throughout Iraq, and there's plenty of Russian oil workers who are actually right now fleeing Iraq because of tensions in the southern region. But there's far more non-Americans involved in the Iraqi oil business now, post-war, than the United States is involved.
Oddly enough, probably the Iraqis were the beneficiaries of Iraq's post-Saddam oil production.
Well, the
increase.
ones that lived, minus the
the
million
ones
that,
we didn't
that died.
kill. Yeah.
Well, we didn't actually kill that many. It was the Civil War that we started that basically killed most of the people.
Yeah, the whole meme about we're there for the oil. This is essentially early 2000s American leftist rhetoric, and there's all these weird theories about how we were going to go into the Caucasus and somehow steal all that oil, completely ignoring modern Russia not having any aversion to that plan.
The completely bizarre Michael Moore documentary, Fahrenheit 9/11.
Right.
Which if you haven't seen it, just watch it, if nothing else, for just the complete internal cognitive dissonance, where I think he manages actually to go through the entire movie without mentioning Israel once.
Well,
that may have been. Maybe we can go full conspiratard. I mean, it may have been. It's conceivable that narrative was pushed to distract people and to give people something to be angry about, when manifestly that war was fought for our greatest ally.
I think that more interestingly, that war showed that the international oil market dynamics by that point, so early 2000s, had reached this. What is it that Taleb always talks about? High amounts of tail risk. This paradigm where there's all this tail risk, and you would think that invading this country and creating this kind of distress would actually have a real effect in the international oil markets, but it didn't. It didn't have a pronounced effect at all.
Well, Iraq they weren't a major oil exporter at that point. I mean, they were doing some oil for food program, but they'd been shut out of the oil markets.
Right.
Prior to 2003.
I think who made the most money, and this is the funny thing, because Halliburton got the sort of big target painted on them by the left about
KBR, Halliburton.
Yeah, like this evil sort of right-wing Texas-based group of companies that were making a killing, and they did make money. But the irony is they didn't make it on oil; they made it on sort of military contracting and stuff, just bringing all these sort of people over there, and it really wasn't like an oil extraction thing. What did happen, though, was that the companies in the United States who were producing oil made a fucking lot of money because the price went up. And so if you're a Texas oil guy, just like happened in the 70s, even if you don't physically control the supply of the oil in the Middle East, it's a global market. And so if the price goes up, you're going to make a lot of money. So it cost the United States, I don't know, $6 trillion or something, last estimate. But maybe $1 trillion of that flowed in the positive way to the oil industry, and then the rest of the country lost that $5 trillion. And so at the time, I couldn't believe the government would do this, and now I've just gotten so used to it. It's like it doesn't shock me, but this is what happens. It's a crony system. You're helping your friends.
Points out that, everyone and their mother was anticipating a rise in the price of oil because the war was announced in advance, and it was his mobster friend Fat Tony who actually made a lot of money betting against exactly that.
The oil, Iraq doesn't cause oil to go up. I mean, maybe there's a bit of tension. You're a little bit worried about the war not going well and something happening in Saudi Arabia. But the reason oil went up 2003 to 2008 is it's China and India, because this is an era where China's growing on the order of 10 to 12% a year.
Yeah.
We're talking about the first Iraq war in the context of what Taleb is the first Iraq war.
Oh, well, okay, all right, never mind then.
That was a supply shock. That's actually one of the reasons, again, going back to Japan, that they had one of their hiccups in their sort of growth era was the oil shock. At that time, they were still somewhat an export power, but they had shifted into this monetary stimulus stuff, which had basically created a real estate boom for them, or a bubble, I should argue, that made the price of the Imperial Palace, the acreage on that plot of land in the middle of Tokyo, more expensive than all of California. And so they were going through some voodoo economics, to lack of a better term. Anyway, but it was the sort of shock of the first Gulf War that did send their economy probably into a sort of downturn, at least on the stock market level.
That and the demographics.
That's a slower process, though. It was I think a shock that sent the Nikkei down from 40K to whatever it got to, like 9,000 or something.
Yeah, they switched their monetary regime in the 90s from they were having something like 2 to 3% inflation to zero inflation, right? So they tightened monetary policy an awful lot. So the whole path of the economy totally changed. Like whatever, we don't need to go into that.
Well, one of the more interesting side effects of that whole period was the huge influx of investment into shale and natural gas production because the price of oil had risen so steadily.
So now we're back to 1999 to 2008 right now, talking about shale.
Yeah. Well, especially after 2008, there was a huge move towards North Dakota and parts of Texas. Like that happened because, my understanding, because the price of oil became so high towards the end of the Bush era. And these companies were flush with cash. They had a lot of cash investments they could make, and just essentially built up, the entire Dakota shale industry towards the end of Bush and early Obama era.
Yeah, a lot of that had to do a lot with cheap credit too. It wasn't so much the majors that were getting into shale; it was these independents that were doing it, like Anadarko Petroleum and such. And it was a lot of the easy money that was being pumped out after the financial crisis that spurred into that.
I have some good notes on shale if we want to talk about that.
Let's talk about shale. So basically, the sort of Bloombergs of the world were basically saying a few years ago that the United States is, the new Saudi Arabia of like North America, effectively. And a lot of that is sort of, PR investor nonsense that you'll read in the front of the 10Ks or something that you get from the company that Warren Buffett recommends you basically ignore and just go to the numbers. But some of it was true because it was extraordinary. I mean, the United States is now producing more oil per day than Saudi Arabia, which is something that nobody thought was possible. So, Alex, why don't you talk about it since you're sort of got some notes on that?
Yeah. So in 1999, an outfit by the name of Mitchell Gas was they're based out of North Texas in Oklahoma. They're in a lot of trouble because their fields are drying up. So they have a super genius on their team, and he has the idea to drill, this is natural gas, to drill past their conventional gas fields deep into the earth, past the water reservoirs, into a type of rock that's called shale. What is shale? I don't know. No one knows. It's some sort of rock. But this is basically like a sponge that's filled with hydrocarbons. So his major innovation is to drill really deep, and then, this is a big innovation, to drill horizontally, which had been done before, but not to much effect because people are basically just drilling into underground seas of oil, so there's not much point in going left or right. But he can go left and right. So they're going left and right, underground, north and south, east and west, and they make these horizontal drills. Then they basically use they have some way of putting tiny explosives distributed throughout these horizontal wells, and they detonate these explosives, and then they fill it with various fluids. This is the hydraulic part of hydraulic fracturing, and this causes basically a network of cracks to form throughout deep into the rock formation, and it allows the oil and the natural gas to seep into the horizontal well and then be under pressure from geological forces pushed out. So the Barnett Shale in North Texas becomes a massive play. And this takes a while. This is starting in 1999. By 2010, it was disrupted. This was already going on in 2007, 2008, but then the crisis, the economic crisis, delayed it because prices of oil and natural gas fell precipitously at that time. But then 2010, 2011, Pennsylvania and Texas start producing colossal amounts of natural gas. And then in turn, in Texas and North Dakota, you have also oil coming out from that. And they just get better and better. at doing the underground imaging and lowering the cost of this deep horizontal drilling. And so you have the Eagle Ford in Texas, you have the Bakken Formation in Montana and North Dakota. You have the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin has a few formations out there. That's in West Texas and New Mexico. And there's other fields.
Where's Marcellus? Is that sort of northeast?
That's Pennsylvania,
right?
And I believe New York State as well. Though the wonderful people in the New York government will not allow that to be drilled.
Right. Was that Cuomo who put that in? Recent?
Some asshole in New York. I don't know.
Which doesn't really matter, to be fair. Like the wonderful thing about the petroleum industry is that if you don't do it now, you can always do it later. It's not going anywhere. So
yeah,
you might have a marginal effect on kind of the prices, but if you decide that you're going to lock up something in some gigantic trust, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people have thought that their natural resources were preserved, but when push comes to shove, the guy with the most guns decide what's going to be sold and what's not.
So let's talk about the reason why places like New York don't want it going on. Partly it's political, obviously. There's votes to be made. But the reason those voters are going to want that is because there are concerns, whether they're valid or not, that what goes on when you drill for shale is going to pollute the environment. That's the primary reason.
It can. So you're drilling really deep. You're going through aquifers. So if you don't seal the well properly,
Correct.
Or if you do seal the well properly, and then because you're basically undermining the rock underneath it, there's like an earthquake and the seal breaks, you can get hydrocarbons into your aquifer.
Yeah, it's not just the drilling though; it's the pressures, because what goes on with the shale is it's not like the old. If you watch, There Will Be Blood. If you watch that movie, what they're doing is they're drilling vertically, and they're basically waiting for the weight of the earth to push the oil reservoir down, and then there's that little upspout that squirts up a bunch of oil. There's no pressure added other than what the sort of geology is doing. That stuff is pretty much gone. That is like, you're putting your straw into a milkshake, and we're hearing that sucking sound now at the bottom.
I drink your milkshake.
Exactly. The reason shale is going on now is because all that other stuff is gone, and the way they get it out, and the reason they didn't do it for so long was because it's fucking hard to extract this stuff. So the way you get it out is you pump in super hot, super high pressure water. We're talking like 18,000 psi. That is, the atmosphere, for example, is 14.7. So way more than what you're going to get from just walking around. And what happens is you fracture the rock. That's what they call it, fracking. So you're pumping this stuff in, and it breaks it up, and then it releases the hydrocarbons, whether there's natural gas or oil or whatever. And in the process of this, you're going to put a lot of pressure on those wells, and if they're, as you said, if they're not cased properly, if they don't have the steel and concrete set up correctly, then that stuff can leach into aquifers, which can really fuck people up. And I think there have been cases where that's happened. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but there's that risk. And it's sort of like nuclear power. If you've got like really, on top of it, engineers running the thing, great. But if you don't, and that's really what you worry about, you got that massive tail risk.
And it always has to work. If you have one well get screwed up,
exactly.
You're going to pollute an aquifer over potentially, hundreds of square miles.
Right. Yeah, and the footprint of shale is quite large. The surface stuff isn't so bad because what they're doing is they're drilling down and then out. But the technology is so sophisticated that they can go out for miles. And so you're talking about 20, 30 square miles underneath each well. And so the footprint is quite large. And even though it's so deep below the aquifer, we're talking 10,000 or more feet, it's that well casing that is critical. And if you don't do it right, because you think about how far that is, like you're going down more than 2 miles. You can't even see it. You're dumping in steel beams at the top, and then you've got concrete poured down below them. you really have to know what you're doing. And again, you can't see it. So that's probably one of the big reasons why it's so difficult to get it right. So anyway, that's the reason why people don't want it. And obviously there's people who do because they make a lot of money on it. And that's sort of, the two sort of countervailing points of view. How that resolves itself, I think it's a question of price and technology and perhaps the political wins, but it's not a clear-cut thing for me. I think it's sort of it's a reality, and I think if people can sort of do things that don't contaminate put other people at risk, I think that's the ideal way to go. But in this case, because of that large footprint, that's not necessarily going to happen. And a lot of these companies recently were in a lot of trouble because of the lower oil prices, and the banks have been willing to keep most of them afloat, which is astonishing, but they are losing money. And so,
well, who's losing money?
The oil explorers, the shale producers.
Well, there was a pruning. So this is kind of an interesting story. So in 2014, approximately, the Saudis freaked out at the U.S. shale industry, and they thought that they could drown them. They thought that they could basically, because a relatively small change in oil production, especially a small change for Saudi Arabia, given how big their base is, can lower oil prices an enormous amount. So they flooded the market with oil to try to kill these U.S. producers, but the U.S. producers consolidated and improved their methods and were able to even make moderate amounts of money on fewer plays at even $45 a barrel.
Yeah, having access to 0% capital also helps a lot if you're trying to weather what you can convince your backers is a temporary price movement.
And it was temporary. I mean, oil's over $70 a barrel now, and these people are making money hand over fist.
And I find it one of the most interesting things to me when you actually look at the kind of interior mechanics of the oil industry is there's just so much fixed capital that you need to make conscious decisions about when you're going to spin it up, when you're going to keep it operating at a loss, and when you're finally going to throw in the towel and shut it down. And these are decisions that, they swing thousands, tens of thousands of jobs, not on a whim, but on a dime, and affect the production of just immense quantities of this stuff. And there's some actual guy who's looking at a lot of these projects in North Dakota, for instance, and is basically, trying to make his best guess as far as what the price level is going to be in 5 or 6 years to whether it's worthwhile to shut down these things that are money-losing endeavors. Because if he's wrong, and the oil price spikes in the next couple of years and you have to start it back up, that's a huge amount of capital basically lit on fire.
I mean, it is and it isn't. That's a big problem for, say, deep water drilling or even shallow water drilling, where you have an oil rig and boats involved. But the fracking guys, they can turn it around fairly quickly, actually, and you can always just send your roughnecks home.
I agree. It's a relative thing. I mean, there's a number that I saw from Q4 2016 to the middle of 2017. The number of rigs went up by 63%. So that's sort of like turn on, turn off aspect of shale is sort of unique to it, rather than the deep water systems, which are sinking like $5 billion into Thunder Horse or whatever that last big one was. That's true. Here's another set of numbers that a guy named David Hughes, who I believe used to be the chief geologist for Canada, and they have a lot of oil and oil sands up in Alberta primarily, and so the Canadians have some pretty sharp people in terms of converting very expensive oil sources into sellable products. But what he did was he actually went down to the United States, and so, believe it or not, this is sort of potentially an objective third party. And he wrote a report that is available on postcarbon.org called Shale Reality Check. And he basically estimated that in order to keep up the production, you're going to need 1.3 million new wells in the United States at a cost of approximately $7 trillion. And this is to keep the production at 12 million barrels a day in the United States. And if you do this for 3 years, you're going to need about that's going to produce about 13 billion barrels, which is more than the reserves that are currently shown in shale. And so just the numbers don't seem to add up. And if you assume that the oil price is $70 a barrel, the amount of extraction or the amount of value you're going to get out of selling that oil is about $1 trillion. But if you look at the cost of drilling them in the first place, this is about 7 trillion. So you're looking at a net loss of about $6 trillion. So look at the report. I ran through the numbers, a couple times, but these are based on whatever inputs I'm given. So check my math and check his report if you want to look into shale further.
People are saying, so I'm trying not to be too emotionally invested in this, because I've heard claims that the Permian Basin is second only to the, I think it's called the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia. And then I've heard, the official EIA numbers do not reflect that. So you hear all sorts of different figures, but I mean, these people today, if nothing else, they're able to make money at $50 a barrel in Texas and in North Dakota. And there's a lot of speculation. Here's an interesting point that I've read, is that anywhere where there was a conventional oil field, so this includes the dry fields in California and in Pennsylvania, and in Norway underwater, and in the Scotland underwater, and also the still productive fields in Russia and in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Under the conventional fields, you have shale, and it stands to reason that you're going to be able to do the same methods that have been successful in the United States in these older, more mature fields. There's less. The reason it took off so well in the United States is because we're very lucky. We're one of the very few countries in the world where the landowner owns the mineral rights. I think even in like Australia, the private landowner does not own the mineral rights. They're owned by the state. So there's sort of like less. A rancher in Australia is going to be less keen to have some assholes show up and start drilling on his land because he doesn't get that 25% of revenue. He doesn't even get the leasing rights. I believe that's how it works.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, you've seen primarily the shale phenomenon occur in the United States. I believe there have been other countries looking at it, but I think that is a big aspect, the sort of legal aspect of it. I've also heard in places like France where they've been talking about it, the environmental concerns, the culture there is much higher than in the United States. And also the population density is higher in Europe and in most other countries. Australia is probably the exception. I don't know how much shale they have, but in Europe especially, I mean, Germany is the size of Texas and they've got 80 million people. I mean, how many does Texas have? I don't know, 20?
20 something.
Yes, it's like 4 times as populous as place like Texas per square mile, at least. So if you screw up the water supply, you're affecting that much more people. And I think in the United States, you just have so much more vacant land that I think people are more comfortable with this type of technology. But you're saying that if you take the dry wells that were not shale in origin, and you're saying you can use fracking on them to get oil.
You can go under them. You go through they're not. I mean, in Iraq and Saudi Arabia, they're far from dry, but you go through them. You go under them, much deeper, like 3 to 4 times deeper, I believe, and under that there is shale. It's just
do you know how much?
No, I don't know. But the story is, the geologists say that where you have conventional oil, you usually, I mean, I don't know, the earth is varied. I'm sure there's some well where there's no shale under it, but there's going to be shale more often than not under these old oil fields.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So
I mean, the United States absolutely dominates this field. We have all the expertise here. I don't think that the Russians or the Saudis are very secretive, but they're not going to publish, their shale finds necessarily. But it's worth considering that all the old off-water sites and the on-land sites, those are also going to be at least worth looking at in terms of shale production.
Right. Okay.
Tight.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know who's telling the truth sometimes because you have a lot of people who obviously are financially biased. I'm not saying that's you, but I'm just saying a lot of the companies who are promoting their latest discovery or their latest technology obviously want to get investors and they want to make money themselves. So you always have to filter it, and there's a lot of people saying different things, which makes this really hard and complicated. This is why I spent so much time researching this, because I don't personally know necessarily what the right answer is. My suspicion, though, is that the resource is finite, and at some point in the future, the price is going to escalate to the point where we're going to have pain. And the real question then is, do you have substitutes for it, or do you have a change in your lifestyle? I think that's the only thing that is going to basically that's inevitable in my opinion.
Yeah,
and so
the Earth is finite. There's no doubt that let's say that you just condition on oil drilling technology that will exist in 50 years just to keep things grounded. The amount of recoverable oil, the curve given the different prices of oil, is fixed, and eventually we will run out of oil at some point. Whether that's 30 years or 200 years is an interesting question.
Do you guys want to talk about alternatives?
Yes.
Okay, so this is another really complicated topic because the incentives to continue with the current infrastructure, especially if it's got an enormous amount of economic and political momentum behind it, are very strong. But it doesn't mean it's all useless if, let's just say, somehow oil all just disappeared, which is not going to happen. It's just going to get more and more expensive to the point where people don't want to use it anymore. So,
can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Good. Yeah, I was trying to talk earlier. Yeah, I did want to talk about alternatives because one thing I want to talk about is the purpose of all this and the impact on the environment, on the ecological systems of oil and other forms of energy.
Yeah, no question. I mean, I don't necessarily have a dog in the fight on climate change, but it's to me the simplest sort of position I can put forward is that there's a chance that this climate science or climate change theory, there's a chance that it's true, and whether it's true or not is not really my point. What I'm saying is there's a chance that it's true, and if that chance of being true is actually as bad as however you want to weight it is a certain amount of bad, you probably want to have an insurance policy to mitigate that. And so I think that's the sort of most rational argument I can put forward without going into whether it's true or not.
The problem with the climate change stuff is, it's used as a rationale for certain powers of the would-be world state, right? And the problem I've always had is contrary to our recent guest Jay Dyer, I would take the Penty-Linkola position on the environment and human participation. I mean, consider
what is that position?
A massive population reduction world over, and his positions would be like total end to all immigration, and basically the ending of population explosions and ending of certain populations, particularly low IQ populations. And I mean, he was considered an eco-fascist because
I would just want to get on the record. I do not advocate any ending of populations myself.
Well, I mean,
not necessarily you're going to take them, behind the woodshed. It's basically like you need to manage the amount of growth of humanity to the point where it's negative. And frankly, that's where it's going. The problem, in my opinion, though, is that the lower end of the spectrum, unfortunately, is growing much faster than the higher end of the spectrum. And
yes,
go ahead.
And not only that, I mean, the Western Europe and America have already had their big mishaps. I mean, you had obviously the Gulf oil spill, you had Exxon Valdez, you had the Ixtoc 1, and the worst oil spill was the Arabs, the Arabian Gulf in 91, which wasn't, I guess, an oil spill per se. It was part of the war. They opened.
Well, even if you're like a pro, like, yeah, burn it, yeah, cool, like get my truck and everything, you got to look at the pictures of those oil fields just on fire, putting plumes
those people
of
are
toxic
disgusting.
waste into the air.
That's pure fucking pig American
it's
garbage.
Horrible. It's absolutely horrible.
I cannot stand those people.
Conspicuous consumption.
Yeah, it's disgusting, but more to the point, like if America loses its world hegemony, then these other countries, I mean China and India, they're going to do everything that they can to destroy the ecosystem and to create a giant mass of eaters to swarm the barren wastelands.
I would say China is not necessarily the leader on that one. Go ahead, Tank.
You can look at the way that China has developed their industrial policy over the past few decades. There's been a distinct shift. Like they're trying desperately to manage the actual conflict that exists between having an industrial civilization with 1 billion people and also having a somewhat livable environment for them, which doesn't mean necessarily that they have an intention of holding themselves to kind of Western European standards of green space or air quality or whatever. But it also doesn't indicate that they're looking to kind of wallow in their own worst excesses. I mean, India is a whole another
situation. I think if anybody who's visited India versus China, I mean, India is squalid. They have less emissions than China just because they can't get their industrial system together to the point where they could. But if they could, given what I've seen of that place, I would say India would be a worse contributor to pollution.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like the problem with India, if you ever get the opportunity, you should definitely corner a high caste Indian bro and get them to chat about their less high agency brethren back home. But Indian society is incredibly stratified, and the efforts that their government has been making with some amount of success and a whole lot of effort, not necessarily amounting to much, have been kind of just dwarfed by the vast scale of their enormous rural population.
Yeah, I mentioned this before on a previous episode, but if you go to Elephanta Island off of Bombay and you get off the boat, or as you're traveling from the city to the island on one of these rickety crafts that they send you on, you're going to see just the amount of pollution in the Bay of Bombay, whatever they call it, and the amount of coal emissions that are coming off the power plants on the water. The place is just filthy, and there's just rafts of trash washing up on this primary tourist attraction. They can't even fix that. China's bad, but I've never seen it as bad as I saw in India.
The Chinese have the human capital to, in time, I think, get a grip on their pollution problems, and they're certainly oriented in that direction and have the sort of central control maybe to do something about it. But the India's big problem is they just don't have the human capital to get people to buy in.
And the Chinese have an interesting demographic situation right now where I think that actually the Chinese government is now trying to incentivize large families again.
Yes.
Their demographic crunch is imminent, and 20, 30 years, there will not be as many Chinese as there are now if the trends continue.
Yeah, they have a huge population bubble incoming that's going to be a major destabilizing force. It's also one of the reasons that it's a little bit concerning. Is one of the things that you do with kind of excess male population in a demographic crunch like that is you find a way to put them to the service of the state, which usually ends up significantly reducing your overall population and that of your neighboring countries.
Right. Whereas I think India, much of Africa, Steve Saylor's the most important graph in the world. Much of Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, so on. Those are going to be the true population bubble areas. And
India, it's really an Africa problem. India and even the Philippines, they've all sort of, if they're not quite at replacement, they're pretty close to replacement. There might be not evenly distributed along the bell curve, but it's an African problem where the Africans still have this pre-industrial, mid-industrial birth pattern.
And when they're being fed by industrial society, their populations are being supported by the industrial society of the West.
Right. I think that's, if you're talking about a Linkola position, certainly I'm not for forced population attacks or forced reduction, but certainly examining whether or not we should be allowing charities to operate in certain ways in Africa or just subsidize African governments. That should definitely be something I think that we as an American society should look into, whether or not we should allow that. It's a very dangerous trend. And the argument that should be taken is we are setting these people up for failure. We are setting them up for mass death and tragedy, because there will come a time when energy supplies will not be able to sustain their living habits. And
agree. And I think this may come as a shock. I mean, I doubt any of our listeners would be shocked by this, but like if you took this to a normie, effectively, if you understand how hunting works and how sort of animal populations are managed, if you take out the super predators, apex predators, and you take out the hunting of those, they're basically, or the if you allow the population, I'll get to the point that if you allow the population of, let's say, deer to grow on its own, and you don't allow predation of them, they're going to actually starve to death at the end of the winter, and you have a huge die-off. But what we're doing is with Africa, we're not allowing them to basically naturally get into an equilibrium. It's almost like the Malthusian theory here, but it's sort of been short-circuited until it isn't, because there are limits to all this stuff. And so you're going to have not just like the sort of smaller population that you would have naturally. You have this sort of enormous population because hunting isn't allowed or whatever, in the sort of animal analogy. But in Africa, you're going to have these enormous numbers of people that are dependent on foreign support. If that foreign support falls apart, you're going to have a way bigger die-off than you would have had if you just had people operating on a normal pace, just like you would in the sort of the animal world.
There's a humane way to do this. You just subsidize Norplant injections, and you explain to African women, like, hey, you've had 3 kids, why don't you take $50 and get on a Norplant injection?
Well, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have seemingly tried to do something like that with their sort of condom, the more comfortable condom, whatever they call it.
That's not going to work. Norplant is the way to go. You just get an injection, and then the woman is sterile for like 4 months or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I agree with you in theory, but sort of the political aspects of getting that accomplished seems pretty difficult, given I don't think the leaders, at least, of those countries are stupid enough to at least not see the political opportunism embedded in that sort of proposal by these foreigners. They would quickly pivot to the position where they would say they're trying to kill you all. I mean, this is the argument that African hoteps make about Planned Parenthood. I don't think you're going to get the leaders. Yeah, you pay them off, I guess, but it's a challenge.
I just don't think that
this whole thing is in kind of a microcosm of what we're talking about, where if you base your entire civilization and all of your civilizational infrastructure on the existence of certain widely available forms of energy, if that takes the form of kind of these very abstracted sources of BTUs like petroleum and various petroleum distillates, or just super Bronze Age with the existence of cheap, easily distributable, easily storable calories. If your entire civilization is predicated on that, and then those things go away, then really bad things happen. If you haven't read Edward Tainter's book on basically civilizational collapse, kind of modeled as a energy surplus consuming endeavor. That is a fantastic book.
Collapse of complex societies.
Yes, Collapse of Complex Societies. It's a short read, but a very good read.
We should say that MPC popularized that. They'd probably get upset if we didn't note that.
I'm glad you guys brought that up because I think that brings it back to not just Africa being sort of at risk here. It's actually the industrialized world as well. The nature of our sort of oil economy is very complicated, as sort of this book is sort of analyzing the complexity issue, and the fact that it's so complicated sort of lends itself to having a lot of economies of scale concentrated in a lot of experts and a lot of infrastructure capital that is very vulnerable to disruption if you knock out a centralized node. And so, in other words, if you sort of like suddenly find yourself living as sort of the Bronze Age pervert would recommend, without having the expertise to do that and also having the sort of territory and resources available to you in order to live that way, you're basically going to die. And most Americans and most people in most countries are not capable of sustaining themselves without having the trucking system working, delivering food to the supermarkets, having electricity to refrigerate all this food. And they call it like the 3,000-mile salad. The fact that food is grown in the Central Valley of California to then be consumed by some wealthy hedge fund manager in Greenwich, Connecticut is sort of absurd if you really think about how complicated that is, whereas all he's doing is eating his lunch. Historically, people basically grew everything locally. They made everything locally. They knew people locally. Right now, we have a globalized system that is very vulnerable to disruption if you especially rip out something like energy.
I wonder how vulnerable it really is. I mean, I'm in favor of a certain degree of localism and subsidizing localism, but if you think about like some of the hurricanes we had, like was it Houston got hit by a hurricane?
Right.
Houston actually proved to be remarkably robust to that. And if we think about
it is like until it isn't. It's like this sort of risk. It doesn't necessarily, because you haven't seen it before, doesn't mean it won't happen. And take a look at Japan. I mean, their entire energy infrastructure got ruined when Fukushima happened because they basically shut off half their nuclear reactors and they had to start importing natural gas to substitute for it. It actually created for the first time in probably 20 years or 30 years or maybe even longer their trade deficit. I mean, Japan has been an export superpower, not as big as Germany, but it's been up there, and that was a huge disruption to them.
Well, it was a huge disruption, but how many people starved in Japan?
You also have human capital that can compensate, and that's sort of my point about Americans is that I don't see it here. I don't see the ability to actually work together, which is what the Japanese have, and I don't also see traditionally what the Americans used to have, the ability to operate independently. I think we've become a very pacified, pathetic group of people that depend on the system to survive, and that's what the system wants it, of course. But if you're going to break away from that, you have to figure out how to survive.
And I'm not endorsing the American model here, but I'm just trying to observe the world and make realistic assessments of it.
Correct. Yeah.
If you look at that Houston experiment where we had the huge hurricane a couple of years ago or a year ago, Houston's an incredibly diverse city. It's totally automobile focused,
right?
And yet it didn't result in cannibalism. And now, the Yellowstone caldera.
Well, Katrina
explodes.
did. I mean, I think they learned a lot of lessons from it.
There's no cannibalism reported after Katrina.
I'm being hyperbolic, but I'm just trying to make a simple point: is that there
is cannibalism that takes place in the bayou, regardless of hurricanes.
Sure, but that's like Florida man shit. That's not like disaster survival induced cannibalism.
Yeah, I would say on the discussion of the system dependency and localism, I think that kind of the localism stuff is a good personal thing to do. It's a good personal insurance. I don't see it as a political solution. And if civilization can be made to be sustainable and in harmony with the ecosystem, in harmony with life, then civilization, I mean, is a system of dependency. That's what it is. I think you can lower that level of it to make it less, pathetic. But I think if you want civilization at all, civilization comes with dependency.
I'm not against civilization, and I agree with your analysis. What I'm saying is that the civilization we have is sort of infected with a virus that is basically like, we need to triage this thing by cutting off the head. And,
I don't disagree at all.
Yeah,
but I think we should.
I don't think civilization's bad. I just think it needs to be rebuilt. It's not going to happen.
Well, the philosophical premise of it, like when it comes to energy, it's like, what's the point of this? I mean, to just feed people, like the man animal. I mean, why is this so good? I think that if we're going to have energy, if you're going to take from the earth and terraform the earth, you should be sustaining a higher form of life, not a lower form
absolutely.
of life.
And this is a good point, because I think the United States culture and society is really questionably not that good. I mean, best example I can give is the suburbs. How wasteful are these things? Basically, people live in these very uniform, architecturally
the
ugly.
Suburbs have like extreme reasons for existing. Like they are predicated on a lot of things, but like they're an emergent phenomenon.
I know they are.
It's not
it doesn't
like
mean it's good.
Can force that.
Yeah, but I grew up in a suburb. I think most of us did. I don't know about everybody, but basically they're a very lonely place. They're very odd. They don't feel natural. I didn't know very many of my neighbors, except when I lived in a small cul-de-sac that had some kind of nature around it. But I've lived in different suburbs, and they're just odd environments. Like, these people have like these windows like kind of offset from the street, and people aren't very close together. And they're an outgrowth of, as if you believe in the EMJ thesis of slaughter of cities, and a few other things. I would add in the fact that the automobile industry had a major influence on the U.S. government with the appointment by Truman of the General Motors executive to the position of Secretary of State, the Eisenhower highway system, fueling this big industrial expansion of the economy, which had benefits, obviously, employment and consumer sort of aspects to it, if you like cars and stuff. But the fact is, today we're stuck in traffic jams for 3 hours trying to get to work in a sort of exurb of some major city or going to the city itself. And people are wasting their time in this stuff. How much energy is dumped into that, first of all, and how much of it is necessary, and how much does it actually help people? Whereas if you look at sort of the statistics of who's happy and who isn't, it seems to be people living more locally, more simply, seem to be much happier with a lot less energy consumption. And so I think that gets the lifestyle change that is sort of an alternative. The other thing that I would say is that, the Elon Musks of the world and the people who support him, and I'm not a critic of him necessarily, but I'm just saying the sort of techno-fetishism of people who think that we don't have to change anything and all we have to do is put in more solar panels, probably aren't getting some of the math behind this stuff, and also aren't asking the question, are we actually addressing some of the deeper problems of our society? Whereas it's sort of like the suburbs again, where you've got a real critical racial problem and it's sort of a socioeconomic problem in the inner cities, and your answer is to build these really ugly, boring, soul-crushing, wasteful energy-wise places called the suburbs as an outgrowth of that. I think I compare even the electric car to this, because I think the need for commuting every fucking day to spend 2 hours a day in a car is sort of silly, in my opinion.
Elon Musk is how you end up with something like Blade Runner. He's one of these technicians that tinkers around the edges without, he can offer, people like that can offer creative solutions to managing something that should not exist.
Elon Musk is primarily like the Reddit whisperer. He has
I mean the archetype of it. I don't know how important Musk the man really is, and I don't really care. I'm just saying these people who
he cultivates the archetype. Like,
you're right.
like his entire shtick, like the same way that Donald Trump relates to pro-Americans, like Elon Musk deeply understands the soul of the Redditor, even if he is not personally one of them.
Yeah, the people who bring, their canvas bags to the grocery stores, but they want the multitudes of Africa to be imported into the forest lands of the Pacific Northwest.
Or they drove to that grocery store in a Lexus SUV.
Right. Yeah.
People love Elon Musk because Elon Musk, I mean, we've had, I think, contrary to these singularity type people, I think that the pace of technological change is really slowed, actually. And that
I agree
tremendously.
What Musk is about is, and
he offers people hope in the sort of system.
The liberal dream is continuing, and we're going to have progress because we have electric cars now, and we have a big screen in the car that we can mess around with.
Speaking of lack of innovation, did you see his latest new brick initiative? I mean, his ideas seem to be getting less and less profound over time. Not to criticize him, really. I mean, there's nobody else really in the business world that I respect as much as him. But it's just, I mean, respect is maybe the wrong word. It's sort of in terms of like admiring an innovator who's able to actually market his way, sort of like Steve Jobs did in a success, even if the products aren't that innovative, perhaps.
He did get a rocket to land vertically, which is maybe the biggest accomplishment of this century.
Yeah, but what does that get you? I mean, rockets themselves are not that useful unless you're putting up satellites. I mean, the fact that he wants to go to Mars, I think, is the most absurd thing I've ever heard. I mean, why do you want to live there? First of all, you have to survive the Van Allen belts and the radiation and the dumping. Talk about energy usage. Talk about getting to another planet, setting up a colony. I mean, I realize I sound like the guys who are like, complaining about Columbus wasting all this energy on these sail ships. But we have to really ask ourselves, what are we getting out of this project? And I don't want to live on a planet with 1/3 the gravity, no atmosphere, no real discernible views of anything other than rock. I personally don't get it.
Well,
what else are you going to do?
Export these surplus populations to the moon or to
There
Mars.
seems to be more
Are you
energy
kidding?
efficient
No,
ways
it's
to
the
do
opposite.
that.
Like, Nick, it's the complete inverse. Like, to ship a kilogram into orbit, I think the price is like $10,000 or so now.
Exactly. So now it's $5,000 per kilo.
Like,
I mean, that's my point. It's like,
there's
great.
There's nothing more implicitly white than a space program. Like, that is apex implicitness.
We can't abandon the planet though to the destroyers.
Yeah, that's my point. I think Earth is a beautiful planet. I actually would prefer to fix what we got.
It's best planet, dude. It's best planet.
Fantastic. It's so gorgeous.
Well, but you can still set aside, say, 3% of GDP to build up these space exploration technologies. It's just not that big of an investment. I mean, you could spend, let's say we give up pet treats and makeup, 3% of GDP.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind personally, but I mean, yeah.
Well, makeup is based on torturing animals, so that would be a good thing to give up.
Yeah. The space program is a topic. Maybe we should do a whole show on it. It's kind of an interesting.
Yeah, we should, but I wanted to get back to, I mean, this idea of energy going forward after not solving the fundamental human problems and cultural civilizational problems that are going on. I mean, is it any wonder that under this sort of scientific liberal ethos that you get this solutions in the form of techniques and new green consumer products as a way to assuage the obvious guilt that the bourgeois upper middle class has regarding.
There was the 70s were probably when the sort of environmental movement really caught hold in the United States, at least, and Earth Day and whatnot, and the hippies and whatever propelled that.
Yeah.
But what happened was people like today, but I think this explains what happened was they got kind of tired of hearing like Jimmy Carter do these presidential addresses about wearing sweaters. They wanted to hear Reagan. And this gets to the human condition of like people are greedy and selfish and fairly short-sighted, in my opinion. They didn't want to hear it. And so what happened was the environmental movement basically had to salvage itself because its PR wasn't going so well, and they had to basically put their energy behind people like Musk. And so we have to understand that sort of social dynamic if things are going to change. I don't think they will until there's a catastrophe when people actually have they're forced to.
As Jay Dyer would point out, I mean, the environmental movement is something that's pushed by these NGOs and oligarch foundations as a way to manipulate people and the Sierra Club, for instance, Sierra Club is not an environmental organization. It's I
think it isn't now. I think it originally
it's a property scheme. It's about they hold the property and then they sell it when it becomes more valuable because everything around it has been developed on I mean, but it was co-opted. It was, the original
Yes, that's my point.
environmental movement comes from the right. I mean, and you see the heretics in the environmental movement. I mentioned Pentti Linkola. Obviously, you have Uncle Ted, and before that, you have the Hitlerist Savitri Devi.
I think it's fair to say that it is not a left-right issue. I think it is more of a personality.
I think philosophically it is a left-right issue because leftism is a fundamentally man-focused ideology, whereas true rightism is a life-focused ideology.
I see. Okay. Well, that's
Saylor has mentioned how the Sierra Club was bought off in maybe the 90s or the 80s to be pro-immigration. I mean, their original position, and this is the logical position, is they're skeptical of immigration because you move people into the richest countries in the world, and you're going to increase usage of resources.
Well, but it also assumes that they wouldn't do that in their home countries.
But they just don't have the income. I mean, if you move somebody, even a high ability person from a poor country into the United States, like instantly, their expected income is somewhere between, I don't know, $40,000 and $80,000, right? And then they have the ability to buy imported crap from China or imported goods from Germany or even domestically produced goods, drive a car instead of taking the bus. Right. Much of the rest of the world is more bus and train focused.
Well, it goes to show that the oligarchs are social control comes before the pretenses of any kind of hardcore environmental custodialship. How do you say that?
We don't.
I mean, because you wouldn't see, they push all this environmental shit, but at the same time, you wouldn't see this insane immigration waves going on if that was actually one of their priorities.
Right. Which sort of actually, there's a sort of tension, it seems, between like these. Well, so Jay would quote the like the Bertrand Russells of the world, these people who were allegedly, about depopulation. It seems to me that the main thrust of the oligarchy today is actually growth, right? Like they're toilet paper sales type people.
Oh, yeah, it's money. It's money.
Well, the idea would be that there's like the Agenda 21 end game of that this either, causes some kind of catastrophe or they deliberately bring about a catastrophe and they have, secured away their, eco bunkers or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's different
I don't want
strata.
to sound like I'm totally dismissing. I mean, it's certainly possible because I think the way that they're looking at the world is they know that they're destroying things. I mean, definitely throw out the very naive. I see a lot of people with this very bizarre, naive view of why the elite are interested in this, that they are, high on their own supply and they want to help people in the third world or some garbage like that.
When
That's
we say
obviously
they,
not true.
it's probably it's worth mentioning that there's strata of people that are in power, and I would say at this sort of certainly higher than me, but lower than somebody like Baron Rothschild. These are the people, even including Jeff Bezos, but I would say he's closer to Rothschild than most. But I would say lower than Bezos, but somewhere above. You're sort of like.
Well, yeah, the managerial
foreman. Yeah, the sort of like guys who are CEOs of sort of middle-sized companies want to make money. Okay, above that though, once you've made your first billion or whatever the number is, you start thinking about power, and you also start thinking about quality of life for you and your legacy. And it should be apparent to these people that what this sort of society that made them all the money is doing is making the land less and less livable. And so they vote with their feet. You see where they live. They live in this sort of globalist elite places, which includes these enclaves. Like New Zealand apparently is like the top destination for a lot of these people who want to have second homes because they see it as sort of a last refuge that has nature, that has sort of a nice quality of life, because they realize all these sort of growth TM places that are growing like hotcakes in around Texas or other growing areas are pretty crummy to live in, and they get in their helicopters. They don't want to go through the TSA system, and they're becoming a literal, what is it, that movie Ethereum with Matt Damon, whatever it was called. I think that's the cryptocurrency, but what Elysium. There you go. That's the Roman heaven, right? So they want to live in a nice place. After they've made their money, they can afford to do so, but it costs a lot. And then they can hobnob with their friends. And I think these people are the ones that are sort of talking about depopulation, because they see
Yeah.
they see the shit that the world is turning into.
Well, that was my point. I mean, the lower tier managerial elite, yeah, they're interested in the shekels, and some of them are even high on their own supply of the ideologies at work here. But when I use the ominous they, I'm talking about the self-aware people who are destroying things, and they know they're destroying things. And yes, they prove it with their actions, their private actions, that they're aware of this, buying up properties in the Ozarks or in Montana or in the mountains of Idaho or what have you.
Yeah.
New Zealand.
Yeah, and I
There
was
are
gonna
certain-
Argentina.
Oh, so go ahead, Alex. You were going to say something?
I was just going to say, I mean, this libertarians won't want to hear this. These are people for whom growth is always good, at least the mainstream libertarians, maybe. But there are countries in the world like Finland, Russia, low population density countries where, yeah, I mean, maybe they're not the richest countries. Finland's pretty rich, but almost everybody has like a weekend house, even if it's not a nice weekend house. Because the population density is low, they have somewhere to go to get away from it all. But in a place like Germany, Japan, the dense parts of the United States, land is just inherently expensive. So there are certainly real limits to even if GDP is high, there are quality of life limitations that are not measured by GDP.
Well, in the spiritual hierarchy of things, the libertarian race is far lower than, for instance, the water buffalo.
Yeah,
or the louse.
Yeah, or the louse.
The simple virus. No, I mean I'm being hyperbolic, but yeah, I get your. My problem with libertarians is they're very selfish. I mean, and that's everybody's selfish, but I think it's sort of a very primitive way of thinking because you benefit by cooperating, and they will say, oh, we're about cooperation, but the problem is. There's crooked cooperation, and what are you going to do? You can't honest your way, and Ron Paul proves this. You can't honest your way to victory. You have to knock those people over the head effectively, and that's the challenge we face. We have a lot of people who have a lot of vested interests in the problems of our society that we all sort of suffer from, and so the question is, what do we do? And that's what I kind of wanted to get into at the end of this. And I'm glad Nick brought up everything that we've been talking about in terms of like the nature of our lifestyle. I think that is probably the most fundamental and important thing we should cover. And I was going to do that at the end because it would probably leave people with more of the profound message. But I do think it's worth talking about the sort of techno actual. It's not just so much like technological. It's more of a practical. Individual level or a community level thing, at least, thing you can do to actually get your life a little bit more independent of the system. And I would predict that, as I've said before, I think the prices of these things are going to go up. And so if you don't want to be dependent on the fluctuations of the global oil market or financial system or whatever, you're going to be served, no matter what, to actually become more secure from that risk. Of having problems in those systems that you effectively don't control. We're not the Rockefellers. So I have a few things that I'd like to cover that I think are somewhat practical that you yourself can do, and then also if we somehow have some political influence and community aspects, we can talk about those as well, which are more complicated. But I think you need to start with the basics. So if you guys remember back in 2008 or so. There was that was when basically the price of oil peaked, if I remember roughly correctly, and there were a lot of people talking about this funny stuff called biodiesel, which actually runs on vegetable oil, and this is something that actually does work. You can actually take vegetable oil, and if you just dump it into a diesel engine, it'll work. But it'll wreck the engine pretty quickly. So what you have to do is a few more things. But
I had a saxophone teacher who had a biodiesel Volkswagen Golf, and he would go to McDonald's and get their excess oil and just pour it straight into his engine.
Yeah, I knew some people who actually were trying to make this a business. There's a big company called Darling that actually is the biggest one that actually goes around and either buys it or has somehow influenced the restaurants to basically give them all their sort of grease fryer pan, the leftovers, and then they take that and they make biodiesel out of it. But in order to do that, you do have to clean it, you have to strain it, and you do have to put some additives into the biodiesel to make it less harmful to your engine, and then you can also optimize the engine as well.
For the record, I never actually learned to play the saxophone. I actually just talked about James Joyce with him. So no, I don't know how to play the saxophone.
Okay, yeah, we should have you do the outros if you did. But the biodiesel stuff is interesting, but the problem is that it's just supply. There's just not enough grease fryers going that you're going to be able to run your economy on it. And a lot of this alternative stuff runs into the same problem. And basically that can be summarized by the word scale. It doesn't have scale. And so that includes even the sort of very basic things like solar panels and windmills and all that. You really have to have the right conditions for that. So if you're going to do that, which you can do on a small scale, you can do it, but you have to really think about, what is the sort of energy mixture that is going to work to balance out the ebbs and flows of the sunlight, the wind cycles, and whatnot. I would say also, hydropower, which frankly is my favorite energy source because it is just the most simple, most renewable source I can think of. Only works, obviously, if you live close to water, and it's just it's very difficult to pull off. If you don't. And so, again, it's a question of what do you do? And do we want to rely upon the government? I would recommend, steering clear of that if you can. But there are things that are kind of promising going forward to a degree, but there's always caveats to them. So I think ultimately you're going to have a portfolio of these things. So never think there's a silver bullet in something as complicated as energy, I would argue. The thing about biofuels also includes ethanol, which is actually being used in the United States today, and it accounts for roughly 10% of the energy usage per day in the U.S., which is pretty impressive in my opinion, given how much appeal oil has. But it runs into a scale problem, and so the reality is the numbers behind the United States' ethanol production are tied to the amount of corn we can grow. And corn is basically a feedstock, not only for our not potato chips, but our corn chips and cornmeal and whatnot for our direct consumption, but it's also given to livestock as well. And so right now, I believe it's roughly 40% of the United States' corn output is actually directed into ethanol. And we get most of our ethanol from corn. You can use other plants like potatoes and things. And these are things actually you can grow yourself if you have the right climate for it. Again, it depends on sort of your personal situation.
Corn is largely fertilized using derivatives of natural gas.
Correct. Yeah, and that's one of the problems that we have, that dependency issue on this sort of
insane
resource.
And it's not a good fuel.
It's the largest. Nitrogen is the largest energy per BTU consumer, or per unit of agricultural output of corn. It is the largest component of energy used. Secondly followed by transportation to move all the machinery and the trucks to move and trains to move the grain to market. The thing about this, as I was saying, was the scale issue. You just start running out, and you can produce some of this stuff in your backyard, which is good. Most of that land is sort of unused, but obviously the sort of efficiency of doing that is going to be lower than on an industrial scale. One of the things I wanted to mention, though, about the Rockefellers was there's a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened to ethanol to begin with, because this is sort of a recent phenomenon on an industrial scale, at least. Henry Ford, who I really consider one of the most impressive Americans in history, actually designed his Model T to run on ethanol. And at the time, it was actually more feasible that you can envision the entire vehicle fleet of the United States running on ethanol because it was just so much smaller. We have at least 300 million running vehicles in the United States, probably a lot more. And so compared to when the Model Ts were coming out, it was much smaller, and so that was more feasible. But there was a very famous quote where he said, the future of the automobile is that apple down the road. You can actually take that apple, turn it into alcohol, and then you can put that into an engine. And ethanol has a higher octane level than gasoline, and so what you have to do then, this is what makes it difficult, partly, is the octane rating is basically an anti-knocking aspect of fuel. And so when you buy 85, 87 fuel, that's the basic lowest octane level you can get in the United States. The higher you get, what that means is that there is a base standard of 100 octane, and then it's sort of a percentage quality level below that you're buying. And when you have octane, which is basically a chemical chain of hydrocarbons that is a smaller component of gasoline as a whole, which is made up of lots of different components of different derivatives of oil, you have this characteristic that prevents knocking, which is basically combustion upon compression. It's not so much ignition by spark, it's more akin to diesel. And so you have basically when two pistons fire at once, you have that backfire, knocking sound that happens, which is bad for engines. So octane has a higher, ethanol has a higher octane rating, and so when you have that, you have to adjust your engine, and this is what makes it a little bit less sort of backyard scale technology. The engines that run in the United States now on ethanol, which is mostly E10, which is basically 10% ethanol up to 10%, can handle basically the small marginal change in the higher power of this stuff. But when you have different mixtures and engines that aren't designed for higher octane ethanol, you basically need to have these electronic injectors which know how to put in the right fuel mixture to balance out that sort of aspect that's going to happen when you have different mixtures. And this stuff is continuously adjusted electronically in the modern engines. So if you're going to do this all with old stuff in your backyard, you wouldn't be able to pull it off necessarily, which is sad. And I guess compared to the Model T, which I guess could run on this stuff, you might be able to tool around in an older engine, but you're going to have all those trade-offs that are happening. So ethanol is an interesting one. I also wanted to mention, in terms of the sort of usage of it for fuel versus food, the equivalent of what you have to put in to make the ethanol, you could basically have about 400. Actually, you could have an additional 200,000 head of cattle for like a typical ethanol plant if it wasn't operating on fuel. So you're going to lose the food potential from it when you do this. So all these trade-offs are very tricky to happen if we're talking on a societal level. Which
my understanding is it's energy negative. Like you're not actually, the inputs are greater than the output in terms of ethanol.
Yeah, I've heard that too, and that may even be true. But again, the reason we use the sort of chemical liquid of gasoline is because it's just it's highly dense. And so that's the sort of reason why we still run combustion engines, is because we're not having to like plug in every 30 miles or whatever it is.
What do you think of natural gas engines?
They're more dangerous. You have to keep them under high pressure to liquefy them typically, because otherwise you can't have a blimp following you down the highway. So they're under high pressure, and I think that's the main limiting factor. I'm not an expert on it though, so.
I see buses that run on natural gas. It was a bigger thing a few years ago when oil was high. But yeah, I mean, we have just so much natural gas that seems to be potentially like a backup.
If you guys know Wall Street figures, T. Boone Pickens had this Pickens plan concept where he was going to run the truck fleet on natural gas. That was called the Pickens plan. And that's feasible.
Interestingly, he happens to be one of the largest investors in natural gas operations in the U.S. It was also why he was pushing wind and solar very heavily.
Right.
Because, of course, during times when those are not producing enough output, you need to be able to rapidly spin up turbines in order to meet the deficit. And the only fuel that can do that is natural gas.
Right. Well, we should talk about natural gas because it is not used as a transportation fuel, but it is one of the largest, if not the largest, producers of energy for turning the dynamos in power plants for electricity. That has become probably the biggest story in the United States since the introduction of nuclear power, which doesn't make up that much of a percentage anymore. And it represents, they call it the peaker power. It's like when you have these spikes in demand for power, when there's a huge heat wave or something, when all the air conditioners have to go on, you can't rely on renewables for that sort of thing necessarily. And so you have to have these very rapid turn on, turn off systems, which again are the natural gas power plants. And so they've taken up a huge chunk of the energy infrastructure. And as we're getting off coal, I should mention, which is a pretty heavy polluter compared to natural gas. Methane which is natural gas, is a very clean in terms of emissions, not just CO2, but also sulfur and all the other particulates that could be damaging to you that coal has. It is a very clean energy source, and so it has taken up a huge chunk of the United States' energy portfolio. And the potential of using natural gas for power is very positive because there are, as we've talked about, a lot of reserves of natural gas in the United States as opposed to oil. So I'm a fan of natural gas. I think it's a good solution for the medium term. I think longer term though, we still run into but resource depletion issues, and it is polluting. And we've got to ask the question of how do we solve the transportation problem. Because it is more difficult to do it with natural gas. And I think Pickens probably picked the trucking industry correctly because it is, you're running these much more expensive, highly tuned truck engines versus millions of car engines, which have more variety to them, and there's also less engineering involved in them. And there's just not enough natural gas to go around for those cars. And so I think if you take a very highly sophisticated diesel engine industry for trucks and then convert that over to natural gas somehow, I think that probably would make some sense.
Well, there is enough natural gas. It's a matter of getting the infrastructure built out to replace the petrol stations, the gas stations.
Yeah.
There's effectively infinity natural gas as well as coal. It's just
well, we have about 400 years of coal if we use it for electricity, I believe. I don't know if you gasify it, what that equals, and I don't know what the numbers are for natural gas. But it's not infinity. It's going to be, depending on what you do with it, right?
It's at least 100 years, which, I mean, it's tough to plan beyond 100 years, right?
Right. But the reality is that I think, again, I just see that the complexity going up no matter what we do. And so I do think that the prices are going to go up, and I do think that people are going to consume less energy per capita. And then we've already seen that. We've already seen
that's happening
in petrol consumption in the United States by about 10% since 2008.
I wonder if we're back up now due to cars getting bigger. But I mean, a lot of the energy, the aggregate use of energy in the U.S. kind of flatlining is due to the millennials not being able to afford houses, living in more efficient apartments.
And we're living less well. I mean, that you can look at the trend. To me, it's fairly clear. And if you extrapolate forward based on some of the technology that is currently available, you see problems. Now, maybe we can sort of get quickly or conclude on it. I'm not sure if that's the point to conclude on, but we can talk about some of the sort of miracle whip, solutions out there that I think have always been the quip about fusion, for example, fusion energy as opposed to fission nuclear power, is that it's the technology of the future and it always will be. We've been talking about fusion for more than 50 years, and so it is not able to produce more energy than you put into it, and it doesn't have that sort of energy density that let's say ethanol might, and so you don't.
Well, you'd be talking about using electric cars if we did have functioning fusion plants.
Right.
It would be an electric car.
Right, but
story.
if you're losing energy on it versus something else, there would be no.
Well, and there are some other. So you can also use electricity to do things like unconvert a fuel cell. So there are various ways that you can turn if you have just a huge source of power, and you're not too concerned about efficiency because you need to be running your power station at a certain volume, regardless of the actual demand. So you can afford to be inefficient in some of your storage to kind of mediate your peak loads. There are some options besides batteries, fuel cells, even
that's hydrogen fuel cells.
And things like even more exotic things if you're willing to go down the efficiency curve. Like if you start growing,
supercapacitors.
I do think we need to be clear, though, on the sort of energy loss significance of fusion. I mean, think about this, like if you're creating energy to then run an electrolysis process to make hydrogen, why would you do that through fusion if you could just take the energy that you took to make the fusion in the first place and make more hydrogen? Because
I mean, currently it does run an energy deficit because it's all research reactors, and I mean, it seems like the fundamental physics probably work out eventually, and there are, given the amount of capital outlays that are required, like if you kind of back of the envelope this, you have a patent and your patent lasts for about 20 years. In order to make a power plant of a completely new design, even if it's fusion and it's quote unquote safe, just the fact that it's a new design with like an energy rich, very dense power source means there's going to be a lot of regulatory approval associated with that. And then you figure out the capital requirements to actually do the incredible amount of engineering required in order to have something that's energy positive in output. And then you figure out that, okay, well, as soon as you prove that, not only in theory does this work, but like these are the specific avenues that you explore in order to prove and actually cause it to be energy positive, people are rapidly going to improve on your initial designs. You're not going to capture a lot of the profits. It's extremely plausible that it's only really worthwhile to fund this as part of some sort of a consortium or government level funding endeavor, which is in fact what happens. But then you run into a whole bunch of principal agent problems where there have been like multiple generations of scientists working on the tokamak and some of these other things that are more oriented around modeling nuclear weapons, like the laser-based fusion projects. And they have kind of limited incentives to actually cause it to be energy positive. Their incentives are basically, okay, can we make a plausible case for why we should end up getting the grants next year? So, I mean, it's a tricky problem when you have a society that has decreasing ability to manage these huge multi-generational projects.
Absolutely.
And you're asking for like just a enormous amount of fundamental engineering to go into it. It's easy for those projects to kind of stagnate.
Yeah.
Which
that gets to the centralization issue of civilization, whereby it is more efficient to run things centrally until the system that is required to maintain that centrality efficiently goes away. And effectively, we're seeing that in sort of the West, where we have these populations and the human capital average quality is just going down so much that it's degrading the ability to run these things properly. And I think that leads me, at least, to the conclusion that what we're going to have to do is decentralize the civilization to the parts and portions that are effectively closer to you, whoever you may be, so you can actually capture some of that return rather than having it rent sought and sucked away by people in the middle who are corrupt. And there's a lot of those people today. And I ascribe that to a massive portion of our society. And so, unfortunately, you're going to have to get less efficient in order to regain some of that return, which in effect increases your current efficiency, even though it is suboptimal on a sort of theoretical level, where the whole society could operate more efficiently. But it's just not happening, in my opinion, in this society.
There's no reason that it has to be fixed. I mean, my personal forecast would be that America would gradually slump toward Mike Judge's idiocracy. Like that's an equilibrium, right? Like we can just burn coal for 400 years or whatever, 100 years, and things just kind of get worse.
Yeah, but do you want to be part of that society? Is my point, and I'm saying I'm advocating.
Do you have a choice?
Separate. Well, I think you do on an individual level and on a sort of larger, sort of small scale level there's enough people that are tired of it that can work together. But I do not include everybody in the country, obviously.
But again, that's not a political solution. That's a personal solution.
I didn't say it is exclusively
like idiocracy could slump on as like you have your own version of an elite enclave.
Look, I mean,
Yeah.
maybe this is a digression, but you can support, like, India is actually a great example of this. Like, you can have a society where you have, for any traits, even socially not important ones, where you can have the mean shift significantly, but what you're really witnessing is a extreme stratification, where each of the strata ends up being relatively stable, but you just have a proportion shift. So, I mean, you're still going to have like n number of people that are capable of keeping a lot of machinery running. It's just kind of, you know, how much automation do you allow to creep in? Like, what's your sort of bus factor? Like, that's the engineering term for like, okay, well, how many people need to get hit by a bus before this project is dead? If there's only one guy who really knows how everything works, then you're kind of screwed if he's on vacation or something. Or, you know, he manages not to have kids if you're talking about some sort of a multi-generational endeavor.
Well, you guys don't think this is a political quote-unquote solution, but I do think, you know, if you... I always start with the sort of technicals because they constrain what's physically possible. Now, you can do a lot with that, and that's where the political aspect comes in. But I would just say simply the Amish run a proto-industrial society or pre-industrial society, and they do it fine.
And the Amish are a political non-entity.
Yes, but in a broader sense, but on a personal, individual, community level, they are very relevant. Their way of life is more relevant to them than the U.S. government is to us because they have factored out that aspect of their lives. So that is a political gain for them. Do they have influence over the political?
No
the
Amish
US
has ever kicked my door in, though.
No, but it's not I think there's a misunderstanding about the political. It's not a political gain. It's a they have to a certain extent opted out of certain conditions. Yes, but they have
independence. Okay, politically, they have limits to that, obviously, because they don't have as much money as the Mormons or something. But the Mormons are much more in bed with the system, and they depend on it. Do you have?
If they were to have political,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, sorry. If they were to, like, just to clear up the terms, political independence would mean that they were a political entity, that they had a political power and sovereignty of their own.
They literally do have political sovereignty. They're one of the only groups that has a measure of political sovereignty.
Can they actually?
Literally,
I don't know
religiously
religiously if
they're with their internal affairs. Like, you don't get any more sovereign than that.
Well, until the FDA comes and arrests them for selling milk or something. I mean,
sure. I mean, well, there's sovereignty where you're sort of like internally sovereign, and like, I mean, to a large extent externally as well. I mean, there's always like, yes, that like the United States federal government is objectively more powerful than the sum of Amish country, but for various reasons, having to deal with a lot of different things, they are like basically left alone to the extent that, you know, a random neighborhood in Chicago that also completely lacks political significance is not.
Right, but I mean, let's say hypothetically they started giving shelter to political dissidents, like
they literally have.
Well, you mean
that's like a thing that
Harrison
happened.
Ford movie with the Witness?
Or Witness, yeah, that's right.
I don't know what movie you're referring to.
It's a great movie.
It's a good movie.
But please go on, Hank. There were instances where that
these
happened?
churches, including the Amish, were like active in. I mean, certainly like the Quakers, more so than the Amish. But the Amish have been involved in cases of essentially like internal political asylum, like not as a matter of policy. Which is, you know, perhaps why they've been able to get away with it, and you know, not to a great degree, which is probably the other reason. But like it's overstated the extent to which they're not politically involved. Like, they are politically involved. They do vote. They do exert political power over things like local institutions, like hospitals, where they're able to effectively collectively bargain for the treatment of that group by that, like, fundamentally political entity. Like, I mean, politics is pervasive. Politics is just, you know, the sort of way that groups in society have of dealing with each other that doesn't escalate to warfare. So, I mean, you can be quote unquote apolitical, but what that really means is that you're not necessarily contending for control of central resources, but that's a very kind of limited view of what you can do with politics. Like, you can use politics to be left alone. Yeah. And that's a lot of what they do. I mean, they effectively have, like, internal tax exemptions to things that otherwise the government would be taxing heavily. Like, that's a political outcome.
It gets to what do you want, and I think the disagreement here with I don't agree with Nick's broader assertion that they don't have political power, but I would say they don't have the type of political power that Nick is thinking of. In my opinion, I think they have a lot of power to do, as Hank is saying, what they want, and there are limits to that and what I would want. But I think you have to be specific about what they're not able to do and what you'd like to do. And then in order to do that, though, you have to argue that it's possible. And this is why I say the techniques are an issue, because if it's not possible, it's not even worth discussing. So you have to be able to accomplish what you want. And there are real examples of what people have done. It doesn't mean that's the only possibilities, but specifically, I think what Nick is saying is that they don't have the sort of physical force that obviously the U.S. government has. That's obvious, but I think it's also to a degree that they don't have the ability to have their own sovereign territory that is actually separate of the laws of the United States. I don't think they have.
They could be crushed in 2 years. Like, if Hillary Clinton were president and she got her assets, or whatever coalition would have been behind Hillary Clinton, got her assets in the media to launch some sort of war on the Amish. Like, say they wanted to do this. They could crush them in 2 years.
If they wanted to be the Soviet Union, they could do it. In the United States, it's a little bit more tricky, because I think people would, like, why are you picking on them? Like, they didn't hurt anybody kind of thing.
No, but you control the media. If you can create a narrative.
That's much harder to do in 2 years.
The fact that they're, like, the last to be targeted is, like, it's like also a political strategy. Like, before you, like, got down the checklist to the Amish, like, the shooting would have already started.
That's a fair point too. Yeah, but Alex's hypothetical is, I think that proves the point I was trying to make, which is just they don't have. You still have the larger political question hanging over you, even if you're able to carve out some kind of autonomy with.
These people have total control. I mean, if you control Hollywood and the news media, it's just a matter of what do you want to do.
All right, this is chapter 2. Chapter 2 is oil. Oil built the world. If you don't know that, I'm going to explain it to you now in such a way. But take a look at this. Starting back here, when Jesus Christ was a choir boy and I had a full head of hair, there wasn't much going on. And this is what happened. All along here, there wasn't much happening. You know, we were cutting down trees with an axe. We were plowing a field with a pair of oxen. If you wanted to go downtown, you got out on your feet and you walked downtown. Then around 1860, we got into oil. Oil and coal and the Industrial Revolution, and bada bing, bada boom. Look what we have. We built this world on the back of free energy. But that free energy isn't going to last forever. Now, I don't want to get into an argument with anybody about, well, we got another 10 years, we got another 20, we got another 50. It doesn't matter. It's going to run out. I don't care if it's 10, 20, or 30 years. It's going to run out. And we have to plan. We have to do something. Because after that, what are we going to have? We're not going to go back to oxen and horses, because this bump allowed us free time. That's right. Energy gave us free time. So we built universities and institutions and laboratories, and we learned a lot of stuff. Unbelievable. But that stuff has to have energy to run. What are we going to run it on? Alternative energy is not going to pick up the slack entirely. So we need to start planning. We need to start thinking about what the world is going to be like tomorrow. And if we don't have leadership in Washington, we are not going to be able to plan. We need leadership.